Rhonda, what is the nicest thing a non-family member has ever done for you?
Hmm. Well, thank you so much, first of all, for inviting me to be in this conversation with you around this particular question. It's a great question, and I'm glad you gave it to me in advance so I could think about it a little. Um, and I have to say, just meditating on this and reflecting, it wasn't easy for me to come up with one story. Um, but the first thing that came up for me as I tried to kind of force myself to really come up with one. Actually, is a story that dates back to when I was a teenager. And I think it's interesting how this is an example of, not a huge thing. And I can think of things that happened more recently that were, in a certain sense, more impactful. But there's something about perhaps the timing of this and the context of this that made it stand out for me. And I'll share more of what I mean as I open it up now. So yeah, as a young girl, I was living in North Carolina first, but then Virginia. And by the time I was a teenager, I was, going to public school, and my family, my mom and dad had divorced. My mom had remarried, um, and my stepfather, on one hand, had helped came along at a time where um, his being a part of our lives was significant. We moved from North Carolina to Virginia. In a certain sense, we had a little bit more stability. We had access to healthcare for the first time. So I should say I grew up in a relatively impoverished um, background. My family, like many African American families who live in the South, um, had for generations tended to be relegated to kind of a almost like a caste like lower class status with working class opportunities, um, quite limited in terms of roles that my family members had played. And I think we were all living consciously and unconsciously with some of the legacies of intergenerational trauma, long-standing, patterns and structures, beyond our individual, can do it spirit or not, but like structures that said certain people weren't able to do certain things. And so that meant for me that the people who raised me were kind of always had their backs up against the wall in some ways. And, we hadn't had a lot of opportunities for education, stabilizing access to institutions like, regular, reliable health care, et cetera. And so when my mom married my stepdad, I was able to experience some of that. My stepdad had been a member of the U.S. military, actually Air Force. And because he had retired in the Air Force, he had access to a kind of regular, socialized, frankly, healthcare system that otherwise hadn't been available. So for the first time, there were certain things that we were able to do, and I was feeling a little bit more of comfort, but there was no extra money for extra things. And so for me, as a young person, the one place where I was able to feel like I could do things and experience more of what, other children with more access to resources could experience was in school. And so, it was a public school where, if you did well enough, you had the opportunity to shine. And so I was a competitive, strong student, notwithstanding the fact of the fact that my parents hadn't had very many opportunities. Um, I was able to do well and to thrive and to feel a sense of my own value under those circumstances. And so it led me to do a lot of things, participate in the band, become a student leader in our student government. But certain things still cost money. And so there was a time when, despite the fact that I volunteered a lot and really was one of those students in a little public school, high school community that, was president of this and member of that honor society and this and that, different bands, jazz band and marching band. And there came a time when there was an opportunity for the students in the band to go on a trip and to experience, traveling outside of the state from Virginia to, I think it was New York at the time, but we also traveled in a similar way to New Jersey. And I don't remember which one came first. But at that particular time, I remember really having done all I could to try and raise the whatever extra money was required of us as like a family or personal contribution to be able to make the trip. Participated in fundraisers and did whatever I could and just wasn't able to raise all of the money necessary. And so I recall having to talk to one of my teachers at that time, my high school math teacher at that time. His name was Mr. Ramsey. And he was well aware that many of the students in the class were going to be away during that period. He knew who was in the band, who knew everybody who should have been going away. And he was making accommodations and meeting with each student and saying, well, when are you going to do this? How are you going to make sure that happens? And he called me to meet with him and was engaging with me around making alternative plans because he knew I was in the band. And I had to share with him that I actually wasn't going to be going because I didn't have the money. And he just stopped and basically said, you, of all students, deserve to be able to go. As hard as you've worked, as much as you contribute, you deserve to go. And he, out of his own funds, his own personal, resources, paid to, and it brings tears to my eyes just to think of it now. But he just took care of whatever that balance was without blinking an eye. He did it without, I don't even think he told me he was going to do that in that meeting. He just said, you deserve to go. And I learned shortly thereafter that I didn't have to worry about that debt anymore. And I was definitely going to be going on the trip with my friends. And so it touches me to think back on that. I don't know if this is how this relates, but it happens that he was the only African-American male high school teacher that I had. Most of the teachers, were of a different background. And so I don't know how much of his generosity toward me came from a deeper than usual sense of kind of the common sorts of struggles that we navigated to try to make the most of systems that were not designed for our thriving. And I know that, I know he wasn't a rich man, but I have come to understand that there were other people and other times when he helped share some of the resources that he had with students like me at that time who were doing the best we could under difficult circumstances and just sometimes needed a little bit of extra help. And for me, that's just one example of many I could point to where it seems to me people have gone out of their way in an individual sense to support me. But I think what's interesting too, as I reflect on that question, is I think of all the different ways that, non-family members, not only is in their individual capacities, but just I honestly feel myself to be an inheritor, like someone who has inherited, the benefits of so many selfless, altruistic actions over historical time. And so, it's not lost on me that, I would not have had most of the opportunities that I've had that I've been able to avail myself of educationally and otherwise, had there not been a civil rights movement in the United States. And before that, various efforts to broaden the sense of who's included in the political and social community in the United States, under our laws and in our Constitution. So I really feel that there are so many different ways that there's a sort of long arc of human history that any one of us might see as part of what explains how we are privileged in this moment in time to live lives of relative freedom and opportunity. You know, none of this just happens. Many people have sacrificed their, you know, interests, sometimes their own family interests, in the interest of greater good. So I guess you know, the ultimate answer for me when I think about, you know, the nicest thing, again, is it's hard. I don't think of it as any one, although I can identify people like Mr. Ramsey, and I want to hold him up because I do think personal actions along those lines are so important. And at the same time, I guess I want to also say that I really feel like I owe this huge debt to whatever you might call that thread in across human history that is moved to take a stand for justice, to take a stand to help, you know, right these kinds of wrongs that we see showing up in this society or that society at this time in this place, through which certain groups, members of certain groups, are treated less than, are given less opportunities than others. And so every way in which I think our long human history has ongoingly struggled against the forces of oppression and discrimination in favor of, instead, opportunity for all to thrive. I have to name that too as part of what comes up for me when I think of the nicest things, the greatest things that anyone's ever done for me.